The morning sun had barely risen over the Virginia hills when Sarah Mitchell pulled her old pickup truck into the gravel parking lot of the Blackwood training facility. The dust settled around her tires as she cut the engine, and for a moment, she just sat there, looking at the sprawling complex of buildings and outdoor ranges that stretched before her. She was 26 years old, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen more hardship than most people twice her age. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt that had belonged to her father. There was nothing about her appearance that would make anyone look twice. She was invisible, and that was exactly how she had learned to survive. Sarah had taken the job at Blackwood 3 months ago, not because she had any particular interest in military training facilities, but because she needed the money. After her father died and left behind nothing but debts and an empty farmhouse, she had taken every job she could find: waitressing, cleaning offices, working at the hardware store in town. When she saw the advertisement for a range maintenance worker at Blackwood, she applied without thinking much about it. The job was simple enough. She arrived before dawn, set up the paper and steel targets on the various ranges, made sure the ammunition was properly stored and counted, cleaned the facilities after training sessions, and repaired anything that needed fixing. She was good with her hands, thanks to years of helping her father around the farm, and she learned quickly. What she had not expected was how much she would love being around the ranges. There was something peaceful about the early mornings before the training teams arrived. The ranges stretched out like empty stages, waiting for performers. The target stood silent and still, and the only sounds were the birds in the distant trees and the wind moving through the grass. Sarah would walk along the firing lines, checking each position, making sure everything was in perfect order, and for those few hours, she felt a strange kind of peace. She had never fired a weapon in her life, not once. Her father had owned guns, of course. Most people in rural Virginia did. But he had never offered to teach her, and she had never asked. There had always been too much work to do, too many bills to worry about, too many problems that needed solving. Guns were just tools that other people used, and Sarah had never thought much about them. But working at Blackwood had awakened something in her. She watched the training teams every day. Special operations soldiers from various branches of the military came to Blackwood to sharpen their skills. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, the best of the best. Sarah would stay at the edges of the ranges doing her work, pretending not to watch. But she watched. She watched everything. She watched how they held their rifles, how they breathed, how they moved. She noticed the tiny adjustments they made before each shot, the way their bodies became absolutely still in the moment before they pulled the trigger. She listened to the instructors giving feedback, explaining the physics of ballistics, discussing wind drift and bullet drop and holdover. She absorbed it all like a sponge without even realizing she was doing it. At night, in her small apartment above the hardware store in town, she found herself thinking about what she had seen. She would lie in bed and imagine the weight of a rifle in her hands. She would replay the movements of the shooters in her mind, breaking down each component of their technique. It became an obsession, though she would never have called it that. This particular morning was different from the others. Sarah could feel it as soon as she stepped out of her truck. There was an energy in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate through the facility. She had heard rumors all week that something special was coming, a training exercise of some kind, involving some of the most elite operators in the country. As she walked toward the main range, she saw the trucks parked outside the equipment building. Black SUVs and military vehicles, more than she had ever seen at the facility before. Men moved between the buildings with a purpose and intensity that made the regular training teams look casual by comparison. Sarah kept her head down and went about her work. She had learned early on that the best way to survive in any situation was to be invisible. Do your job, stay quiet, and don't draw attention to yourself. It was a lesson life had taught her many times over. The main range at Blackwood was a 1,000-meter facility with multiple shooting positions and a sophisticated target system that could present moving targets at various distances. Sarah had set it up hundreds of times, and she could do it in her sleep. She moved along the target line, checking each position, making small adjustments, ensuring everything was exactly where it needed to be. She was halfway down the line when she heard the voices approaching. A group of men walked onto the range, and Sarah immediately knew they were different from the usual training teams. There were about 20 of them, all built like athletes, with the easy confidence of people who had tested themselves against the worst the world had to offer and come out victorious. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of thousands of hours of training. Navy SEALs. She recognized the quiet intensity, the watchful eyes, the way they seemed to take in everything around them without appearing to look at anything in particular. These were the warriors she had heard stories about, the men who operated in the shadows and did the impossible. Sarah continued her work, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She just needed to finish setting up the FAR targets, and then she could disappear back to the equipment building until they were done. But fate had other plans. She was adjusting the last target, a steel silhouette at 800 meters, when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find one of the SEALs standing behind her, watching with curious eyes. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with broad shoulders and the lean build of a distance runner. His brown hair was cropped short, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting in harsh sunlight. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and there was something in his expression that was both assessing and kind. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She was not supposed to be on the range when training teams were present. She had broken the rules by taking too long with her work, and now she was going to get in trouble. The man smiled, and it transformed his face from intimidating to almost friendly. He said his name was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Cole, and he asked if she was the one who set up the ranges every morning. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She expected him to tell her to leave, to report her to the facility manager for being where she was not supposed to be. Instead, he surprised her. He said he had noticed how precisely the targets were always positioned. He had trained at dozens of facilities around the world, and he had never seen targets set up with such consistency and attention to detail. He wanted to know who was responsible. Sarah did not know what to say. No one had ever complimented her work before. No one had ever noticed her at all. She mumbled something about just doing her job and tried to move past him toward the exit, but Marcus stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. There was something in his eyes, a recognition of something that Sarah did not understand. He asked her if she had ever fired a rifle. The question caught her off guard. She shook her head, feeling foolish. Why would someone like her ever fire a rifle? She was just the person who set up the targets. She was nobody. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Sarah felt like he was seeing something that she herself could not see. He asked her how she knew exactly where to position the targets for optimal visibility and challenge. He asked her how she knew to adjust for the slight rise in the terrain at the 600-meter line. He asked her how she understood the way the morning light would affect the shooter's sight pictures. Sarah did not have answers to these questions. She had never thought about why she did things the way she did. She just did them. It felt right. It felt natural. The targets went where they were supposed to go, and she knew where that was without anyone telling her. Marcus called over to his team, and suddenly, Sarah found herself surrounded by a group of Navy SEALs who were all looking at her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. One of them, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, laughed and asked if Marcus was seriously going to waste their training time on the range girl. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and never be seen again. This was exactly why she stayed invisible. This was exactly why she never drew attention to herself. Because when people noticed you, they judged you. And the judgment was always the same. She was nobody. She was nothing. She was just a poor girl from a failed farm who cleaned up after real soldiers. But Marcus did not seem to hear the mockery. He was still looking at Sarah with that strange recognition in his eyes. He said he wanted to try something. He unslung the rifle from his shoulder, a sleek black weapon that looked impossibly complex and dangerous, and he held it out toward her. Sarah stared at the rifle like it was a snake that might bite her. She did not touch it. She did not move. She just stood there, frozen, while 20 of the most elite warriors in the world watched her. Marcus spoke softly, so only she could hear. He said he had been doing this job for 15 years. He had trained hundreds of operators, and he had learned to recognize something in people that most others missed. He called it the gift. Some people were born with an instinctive understanding of shooting, a natural ability that could not be taught. It was rare, incredibly rare. But when he saw it, he knew. He said he saw it in her. Sarah wanted to laugh. The idea was absurd. She was a 26-year-old maintenance worker with no training, no experience, and no business holding a weapon. She had never even touched a gun. How could she possibly have any kind of gift? But there was something in Marcus's voice that made her pause. Something sincere and certain that cut through all her self-doubt. He was not mocking her. He was not setting her up for humiliation. He genuinely believed what he was saying. The massive SEAL who had laughed before spoke again. He said this was ridiculous. They had limited training time and a critical mission coming up. They did not have time to play games with the help. Several other team members nodded in agreement. They were getting restless, anxious to begin their training. Sarah was wasting their time, and everyone knew it except apparently Marcus. But Marcus did not back down. He said he would take full responsibility. He just wanted 5 minutes. 5 minutes to prove either himself right or wrong. If he was wrong, he would never mention it again. But if he was right, they would all want to know. There was a long moment of silence. The other SEALs exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the skepticism written on their faces. But there was also something else. Respect for Marcus, perhaps, or curiosity, or simply a willingness to let their chief have his moment before they moved on to serious work. Finally, the big SEAL shrugged and said, "Fine. 5 minutes." But when the girl proved she did not know the stock from the muzzle, they were done with this nonsense. Marcus turned back to Sarah and held out the rifle again. His eyes were kind and his voice was gentle. He said she did not have to do this. There was no pressure. But he thought she might surprise herself if she tried. Sarah looked at the rifle. She looked at the SEALs watching her with barely concealed amusement. She thought about all the times in her life when she had been overlooked and dismissed. She thought about her father, who had never believed she could do anything important. She thought about the years of invisibility, of being treated like she did not matter. Something inside her shifted. She reached out and took the rifle from Marcus's hands. The weight of it was different than she had imagined, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The metal and polymer felt cool against her palms, and there was a solidness to it that she found strangely comforting. She had never held anything that felt so purposeful, so precisely engineered for a single function. Marcus showed her the basics. He explained how to hold the rifle, how to shoulder it, how to find the sight picture. His instructions were simple and clear, and Sarah absorbed them immediately. It was as if he was reminding her of something she had always known, rather than teaching her something new. The other SEALs had stopped talking. They were watching with more interest now, their skepticism giving way to something else. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but strangely, she did not feel nervous anymore. The rifle in her hands had changed something. She felt centered, focused, present in a way she had never experienced before. Marcus pointed to a target at 300 meters, a simple steel silhouette, the same kind she had set up thousands of times. He told her to take a breath, let it out slowly, and squeeze the trigger when she felt ready. Sarah raised the rifle to her shoulder. The stock fit against her body as if it had been made for her. She looked through the optic and found the target instantly, a natural alignment that required no thought or adjustment. The world around her seemed to fade away. The watching seals, the morning sun, the sounds of birds in the trees. Everything disappeared except her, the rifle, and that steel silhouette 300 meters away. She breathed in. She breathed out. And then she pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed across the range, and a fraction of a second later, the distinctive ping of a bullet striking steel rang out through the morning air. For a moment, nobody spoke. Sarah lowered the rifle and looked at Marcus. His face had split into a wide grin, and there was vindication in his eyes. He said nothing. He did not need to. The big SEAL who had mocked her stepped forward. His expression had changed completely. The amusement was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like awe. He asked Marcus to move the target back. He wanted to see that again. Marcus looked at Sarah. His eyes asked the question without words. "Are you willing to continue?" Sarah thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The years of struggle and hardship, the loneliness and invisibility, the feeling that she would never amount to anything important. And now, here she was, holding a rifle she had never touched before, surrounded by elite warriors who were suddenly looking at her with respect instead of dismissal. She nodded. Marcus gave orders to adjust the target system. The steel silhouette at 300 meters dropped down, and a new target appeared at 500 meters, farther away, a more difficult shot, a test. Sarah raised the rifle again. She found the target through the optic. She noticed the slight crosswind coming from the left, something she had observed in the swaying of the grass without consciously thinking about it. She made an instinctive adjustment, shifting her aim slightly to compensate. She breathed in, she breathed out. She pulled the trigger. The ping of steel rang out across the range. The SEALs erupted in surprised exclamations. Several of them stepped closer to Sarah, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Questions began to fly. Who was she? Where had she trained? How long had she been shooting? Sarah lowered the rifle and looked at them with confusion. She had no answers to their questions. She had never trained anywhere. She had never shot a weapon before this moment. She was just the girl who set up the targets. But even as she said the words, she knew that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just the invisible maintenance worker. She was no longer just the poor girl from the failed farm. She was something else now, something she did not yet understand. Marcus took the rifle from her hands with an expression of deep satisfaction. He told the others to pay attention. He said they were witnessing something rare and extraordinary. Whatever this woman had, it was not learned. It was not trained. It was pure natural ability, the kind that came along once in a generation. Sarah did not know what to say. Her hands were trembling slightly, though not from fear. It was something else. Excitement, perhaps. Or recognition. She had spent her whole life feeling like she did not belong anywhere, like she was meant for nothing special. And now, in the space of a few minutes, everything she believed about herself had been called into question. The big SEAL who had mocked her earlier walked up to her. He was enormous up close, easily 6'4" and over 250 pounds. His face was weathered and scarred, the face of a man who had seen combat and survived. But his eyes were kind now, and there was genuine respect in his voice when he spoke. He introduced himself as Senior Chief Tony Reeves. He said he owed her an apology. He had been wrong to dismiss her, and he was man enough to admit it. Then he asked a question that would change the course of Sarah Mitchell's life forever. He asked if she wanted to learn. Sarah looked at the rifle in Marcus's hands. She looked at the targets she had set up so many times. She looked at the men who were now watching her with expectation and hope. And she thought about all the years she had spent wondering if there was something more to her life than survival and invisibility. She said yes. And with that single word, Sarah Mitchell took the first step on a journey that would lead her places she had never imagined. She did not know it yet, but her life would never be the same. The girl who set up targets was about to become something extraordinary. But that morning on the range, she was simply a young woman who had discovered a gift she never knew she had. And as the sun rose higher over the Virginia hills and the SEALs gathered around to begin teaching her everything they knew, Sarah felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. 3 months passed, and Sarah Mitchell became a different person. She still worked at the Blackwood training facility, still arrived before dawn to set up the targets and maintain the ranges, but everything else about her life had transformed in ways she could never have predicted on that morning when Marcus Cole handed her his rifle. The SEALs had kept their word. After witnessing her natural ability on the range, they had taken her under their collective wing with an enthusiasm that still surprised her. Every day after her maintenance work was complete, she would find her way to whatever range the team was using, and they would teach her. Marcus became her primary instructor, but the others contributed as well. Tony Reeves, the big man who had initially mocked her, became one of her fiercest advocates. He taught her about rifle maintenance and cleaning, about understanding the mechanics of the weapons she was using. He was patient and thorough, never making her feel stupid for asking questions, always treating her like a serious student. Other team members taught her different skills. A quiet sniper named Jackson showed her how to read wind at long distances, how to use the mirage coming off the ground to estimate wind speed and direction. A young operator called Rodriguez worked with her on shooting positions, teaching her how to stabilize her body in unconventional stances. Even the team's medical specialist, a woman named Lieutenant Commander Elena Vega, spent time with Sarah, teaching her about the physiology of shooting, about controlling heart rate and breathing under stress. Sarah absorbed it all like she had been starving for this knowledge her entire life, which, in a way, she had been. Her progress was nothing short of remarkable. Within weeks, she was shooting at distances that took most operators years to master. Her natural instincts, combined with the expert instruction she was receiving, created a combination that none of the SEALs had ever seen before. She seemed to understand ballistics on an intuitive level, making calculations in her head that others needed computers to figure out. But it was not just her shooting that improved. Sarah herself was changing. For the first time in her life, she belonged somewhere. She had people who believed in her, who invested time and energy in her development, who treated her like she mattered. The transformation in her confidence was visible to everyone who knew her. She stood taller. She spoke more freely. She looked people in the eye instead of avoiding their gaze. The facility manager, a retired Marine colonel named Harrison, noticed the change. He had initially been skeptical when Marcus came to him with a proposal to formally train Sarah. Bringing a civilian maintenance worker into the world of special operations training was unusual, to say the least. But Marcus had been persuasive, and Colonel Harrison had learned to trust the SEAL's instincts. Now, watching Sarah on the range, Harrison understood why Marcus had pushed so hard. The young woman was extraordinary. She was already outperforming some of the junior operators who came through Blackwood for training, and she was getting better every day. But not everyone was happy about Sarah's rise. There was a group of contractors who worked at Blackwood, former military operators who now made their living training soldiers for private security companies. Their leader was a man named Victor Crane, a former Army Ranger with a distinguished record and a personality that rubbed many people the wrong way. Crane had watched Sarah's development with growing hostility. He did not like the attention she was receiving from the SEALs. He did not like that a maintenance worker was being treated like a serious operator. And most of all, he did not like that a woman was excelling in a world that he believed belonged to men. He was not shy about expressing his opinions. Sarah first encountered Crane directly about 2 months into her training. She was practicing on one of the smaller ranges, working on transitioning between targets at varying distances. Marcus was nearby, observing and offering occasional feedback. The session was going well. Sarah was in the zone, hitting target after target with the kind of precision that made even experienced shooters shake their heads in disbelief. Then Crane appeared. He walked onto the range without invitation, his body language aggressive and confrontational. He was a big man, not as large as Tony Reeves, but thick and powerful with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard physical training. His face was handsome in a rough way, but there was a meanness in his eyes that made Sarah uncomfortable immediately. He stood watching her for several minutes without speaking. Sarah tried to ignore him, tried to focus on her work, but his presence was distracting. She missed a shot, her first miss in over an hour, and she saw Crane smile. He began to talk. His voice was loud enough for Marcus and several other operators nearby to hear. He said it was entertaining watching the SEALs play pretend with their little project. He said they were wasting their time on a woman who would never be anything more than a novelty act. He said real combat required more than the ability to hit paper and steel on a controlled range. It required guts, strength, and a willingness to do violence that women simply did not possess. Sarah felt her face flush with anger. She had spent her whole life being dismissed and overlooked, and she had thought those days were behind her. But here was this man, this stranger, telling her she was worthless in front of the people who had become her family. Marcus stepped forward, his face dark with anger. He told Crane to leave. This was a private training session, and Crane had no business being here. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Sarah could see other SEALs moving closer, ready to intervene if necessary. But Crane was not finished. He laughed at Marcus and called him soft. He said the legendary Navy SEALs had become so desperate for validation that they were reduced to training cleaning ladies. He said when the real work started, when the bullets were flying and lives were on the line, Sarah Mitchell would fold like every other pretender he had ever seen. Then he walked away, still laughing, leaving a poisonous silence in his wake. Sarah stood frozen, the rifle heavy in her hands. She wanted to cry, but she would not give Crane the satisfaction. She wanted to run, but that would only prove him right. So she did the only thing she could do. She raised the rifle, found the farthest target on the range, and fired. The bullet struck center mass, a perfect hit. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder and told her not to let Crane get in her head. He said men like Crane were threatened by anyone who challenged their view of the world. Sarah's success made Crane feel small, so he tried to make her feel smaller. It was the behavior of a bully and a coward. Sarah nodded, but the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. For all her progress, for all her newfound confidence, there was still a part of her that believed what Crane had said. She was just a cleaning lady playing pretend. She did not belong in this world. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah cried for the first time in months. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw the same nobody she had always been. The girl who was invisible. The girl who did not matter. The girl whose own father had never believed in her. She thought about quitting. She could go back to her old life, find another job at another hardware store in another town. She could return to being invisible, which was safe even if it was empty. She could stop pretending to be something she was not. But then she thought about Marcus and Tony and Jackson and Rodriguez and Elena. She thought about the way they looked at her, like she was capable of greatness. She thought about all the hours they had invested in her, all the faith they had shown. If she quit now, she would not just be letting herself down. She would be letting them down, too. Sarah made a decision that night. She would not run. She would not hide. She would prove Crane wrong, and she would prove something to herself in the process. The next morning, she arrived at the facility earlier than usual. She went to the 1,000-meter range and began setting up targets, but this time with a different purpose. She set them at distances she had never attempted before. 800 meters, 900 meters, 1,000 meters. Distances that even experienced snipers found challenging. When Marcus arrived an hour later, he found Sarah already shooting. She was prone in the grass, her body perfectly still, working targets at ranges that most shooters would consider impossible for someone at her level of experience. He watched in silence as she fired again and again. Her hit rate was not perfect at these extreme distances, but it was far better than it should have been. She was missing maybe 2 out of every 10 shots, which was remarkable considering she had only been shooting for 3 months. When she finally stopped and stood up, Marcus saw something different in her eyes. The doubt and fear that had been there after Crane's attack were gone. In their place was determination, a fierce resolve that made her look like a completely different person. She told Marcus she wanted to push harder. She wanted to learn everything, no matter how difficult. She wanted to become so good that no one could ever dismiss her again. Marcus smiled. He said he had been waiting for this moment. He knew Crane's attack would either break her or forge her into something stronger. He had hoped for the latter, and he had gotten his wish. From that day forward, Sarah's training intensified. She began working with weapons systems she had never touched before. Precision rifles capable of hitting targets at over a mile, submachine guns for close-quarters scenarios, pistols for quick, reactive shooting. She learned to move and shoot, to clear rooms, to operate as part of a team. The other SEALs noticed the change in her and responded with even more dedication to her development. They pushed her harder, demanded more, treated her less like a student and more like a fellow operator. The distinction was important. She was no longer someone they were teaching for curiosity's sake. She was someone they were preparing for something real. And then, 6 months after that first morning on the range, something unexpected happened. Colonel Harrison called Sarah into his office. She had never been summoned there before, and she felt nervous as she walked through the administrative building to his door. She could not imagine what she had done wrong, but her old instincts told her that being called to the boss's office was never a good thing. When she entered, she found not just Harrison, but Marcus and Tony as well. They were all looking at her with expressions she could not read. Serious but not angry. Something else entirely. Harrison told her to sit down. His voice was calm but heavy with significance. He said he had received a request from the Department of Defense. They had heard about her unusual abilities and rapid development. They wanted to see for themselves. Sarah did not understand. She asked what that meant. Harrison explained that the military was always looking for exceptional talent. There was a program, highly classified, that trained civilian specialists for certain intelligence and security roles that did not require formal military enlistment. The program identified people with unique abilities and provided them with advanced training. Upon completion, these specialists were assigned to support roles for various government agencies. Marcus leaned forward. He told Sarah this was an incredible opportunity. The program was invitation only, and invitations were extremely rare. If she accepted, she would receive training from the best instructors in the world. She would work alongside military and intelligence professionals at the highest levels, and she would finally have official recognition for the abilities she had demonstrated. Tony added that they would miss her at Blackwood. She had become part of the team, and the facility would not be the same without her. But they also knew she was capable of so much more than setting up targets and training with them in stolen hours. She deserved a real opportunity to develop her potential. Sarah sat in stunned silence. This morning, she had been the maintenance worker who was learning to shoot. Now she was being offered a chance to enter a classified government training program. The transformation was so sudden and so complete that she could not fully process it. She asked what would happen if she said no. Harrison shrugged. He said nothing would happen. She could continue working at Blackwood, continue training with the SEALs on an informal basis, continue living her life as it was. No one would think less of her. But he wanted her to understand that this opportunity might not come again. The people who ran the program had seen her file, seen the assessments Marcus had written about her abilities. They wanted her specifically. Sarah thought about her life. She thought about the years of invisibility and struggle. She thought about Crane and all the other people who had dismissed her. She thought about her father, who had never believed she could be anything special. And she thought about Marcus, standing in front of her on the range 3 months ago, holding out his rifle with complete faith that she was capable of something extraordinary. She said yes. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork and preparation. Sarah underwent extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and medical examinations. She met with serious people in dark suits who asked her endless questions about her life, her motivations, and her goals. She signed documents that she did not fully understand, agreeing to levels of secrecy and confidentiality that seemed almost absurd for someone who had been a maintenance worker just months ago. And then, on a cool morning in October, she said goodbye to Blackwood. Marcus drove her to the airport personally. They sat in his truck in the short-term parking lot, neither of them quite ready to say the final words. Sarah looked at this man who had changed her life, who had seen something in her that no one else had ever seen, and she did not know how to express what she felt. She told him she was scared. She had never left Virginia. She had never been on an airplane. She did not know what was waiting for her, and she was terrified of failing and proving everyone right about her. Marcus turned to face her. His expression was serious but kind, the same expression he had worn on that first morning when he handed her his rifle. He told her that fear was normal. Fear was healthy. But fear was not a reason to stop. The bravest people he had ever known were not the ones without fear. They were the ones who felt the fear and moved forward anyway. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A challenge coin, the kind that military units gave to their members. On one side was the trident of the Navy SEALs. On the other was an inscription that read, "The only easy day was yesterday." He pressed the coin into her palm and closed her fingers around it. He said she had earned it. Not officially, maybe. She was not a SEAL and never would be. But in his eyes and in the eyes of his team, she was one of them. She had proven herself worthy, and no matter where she went or what she did, she would always be part of their family. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, but she did not try to hide them. She hugged Marcus fiercely, holding on for a long moment before finally letting go. Then she grabbed her bag, stepped out of the truck, and walked toward the terminal without looking back. The next chapter of her life was about to begin. She did not know it yet, but the training she was about to receive would push her to her absolute limits. She would face challenges that made her time at Blackwood look like a warm-up. She would encounter enemies who made Victor Crane look like a friendly rival, and she would discover that her abilities extended far beyond what anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. But all of that was still in the future. As Sarah Mitchell walked through the airport terminal, clutching a challenge coin in her pocket and a one-way ticket to a destination she had been told not to share with anyone, she was simply a young woman taking the biggest risk of her life. She was still scared. She was still uncertain, but she was no longer invisible. And she was no longer running from her potential. She was running toward it. The facility where Sarah received her advanced training had no official name. It existed in the mountains of a western state, hidden from satellite view by a combination of natural terrain and deliberate camouflage. The instructors who worked there were ghosts, people whose names she would never know and whose faces she would never see again after her training was complete. For 18 months, Sarah pushed herself beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. The training was brutal in ways that words could not capture. She learned to shoot in conditions that would have been unthinkable at Blackwood. Extreme cold, blistering heat, driving rain, howling wind. She learned to function on no sleep, no food, and no hope. She learned to endure physical and mental stress that broke many of her fellow trainees. Because she was not alone. There were others in the program, men and women who had been identified as possessing exceptional abilities in various fields. Some were language specialists, capable of learning new tongues in weeks rather than years. Some were cryptographers, minds that could solve puzzles that would stump supercomputers. And some, like Sarah, were shooters. But even among this elite group, Sarah stood out. Her instructors had seen gifted marksmen before. The program attracted the best of the best, people who had already proven themselves at the highest levels of military and law enforcement. But they had never seen anyone quite like Sarah Mitchell. Her accuracy at extreme distances defied explanation. She seemed to know where a bullet would land before she pulled the trigger, making adjustments for wind, temperature, and humidity that were almost prescient in their precision. When other shooters struggled with the complex calculations required for 1,000-meter shots, Sarah made those calculations instinctively, as naturally as breathing. The program's lead instructor, a woman known only as Director Chen, took a special interest in Sarah's development. Chen was a legend in intelligence circles, though most of the world had never heard her name. She had spent 30 years operating in the shadows, running operations that had shaped the course of global events. Now she dedicated herself to identifying and developing the next generation of exceptional operatives. Chen recognized something in Sarah that went beyond marksmanship. She saw a young woman with an unusual combination of natural ability, disciplined work ethic, and psychological resilience. Sarah did not break under pressure. She did not panic when things went wrong. She adapted, improvised, and overcame. These were not skills that could be taught. They were born from a lifetime of hardship and struggle. Chen began giving Sarah additional assignments, missions that existed outside the normal training curriculum, intelligence gathering exercises in nearby cities, surveillance operations against mock targets, scenario-based simulations that tested not just her shooting, but her judgment and decision-making under stress. Sarah excelled at all of it. By the time she graduated from the program, she was considered one of the most promising operatives to emerge in a decade. She received offers from multiple agencies, each competing for the chance to add her to their roster. But Sarah had already made her choice. She wanted to work in protective services. It was not the glamorous choice. Many of her fellow graduates were going into field operations, the kind of work that made for exciting stories and rapid advancement. But Sarah had not come this far to seek excitement or glory. She had come this far because Marcus Cole had seen something in her. Because a group of Navy SEALs had believed in her potential. She wanted to use her abilities to protect people, to stand between innocent lives and those who would harm them. Her first assignment was supporting the security detail for a senior diplomat who was negotiating a sensitive treaty in Eastern Europe. The work was mostly waiting and watching, long hours of vigilance punctuated by brief moments of tension. Sarah spent weeks observing her surroundings, identifying potential threats, and planning contingencies for scenarios that would hopefully never happen. And then, one evening, they did. The diplomat was attending a private dinner at a hotel in Vienna. Sarah was positioned in an adjacent building, providing overwatch from a window with a clear view of the hotel entrance. She was one of 3 operators providing long-range support for the ground team, which consisted of 8 close protection specialists inside the hotel itself. The attack came without warning. 3 vehicles converged on the hotel simultaneously, and armed men poured out before the ground team could react. Gunfire erupted in the lobby. Explosions shattered windows on the first floor. Chaos engulfed the building in seconds. Sarah watched through her scope as the situation deteriorated. She could see hostiles taking positions around the hotel, cutting off escape routes. She could hear the frantic radio traffic from the ground team, their careful plans falling apart in the face of overwhelming force. And then she saw him. A shooter had taken position on a rooftop across from the hotel, directly in line with the emergency exit that the ground team was trying to use to evacuate the diplomat. He was professional, well hidden, and clearly waiting for his target to emerge. When that door opened, he would have a clear shot at anyone coming through. The ground team did not know he was there. Their communications were focused on the threat inside the hotel. They were about to walk the diplomat directly into an ambush. Sarah had to make a decision. The distance was significant, over 700 meters with a crosswind that was gusting unpredictably. The target was partially concealed behind a ventilation unit, presenting only his head and shoulders. The shot was difficult under ideal conditions, and these conditions were far from ideal. But if she did not take the shot, the diplomat would die. Sarah controlled her breathing. She felt the wind on her face and calculated its effect on her bullet. She accounted for the slight downdraft that was coming off the taller building to her left. She made a dozen calculations in the space of 2 seconds, all of them instinctive, all of them precise, and then she pulled the trigger. The shot traveled across the city, a tiny piece of metal moving faster than sound. It arced through the wind, adjusted by gravity and air resistance, following a path that Sarah had predicted with supernatural accuracy, and then it found its target. The hostile shooter collapsed. Sarah immediately began scanning for additional threats, her training taking over. She identified 2 more hostiles on nearby rooftops and eliminated them both in the span of 30 seconds. Each shot was as precise as the first, each bullet finding its mark with devastating efficiency. The ground team evacuated the diplomat without further incident. The attack had failed, though the full picture of who was responsible and why would take weeks to unravel. By the time the dust settled, Sarah had already been relocated to her next assignment, but her actions that night had not gone unnoticed. Director Chen contacted Sarah personally to congratulate her. The shots she had made were already being studied at the training facility, held up as examples of what was possible when natural ability met proper training. Sarah had saved the diplomat's life, and by extension, had preserved a treaty that would bring stability to a troubled region. But more than that, Sarah had proven something to herself. She had faced the ultimate test, the moment when all her training either mattered or did not, and she had succeeded. The girl who had once been invisible, who had set up targets on a range and wondered if she would ever amount to anything, had become exactly what Marcus Cole had predicted she could be. In the years that followed, Sarah continued to work in protective services. She supported security details for dignitaries, executives, and other high-value individuals whose safety was of national importance. She operated mostly in the shadows, her name unknown to the public, her face never appearing in photographs or news reports. But within the intelligence community, her reputation grew. She became known as one of the most reliable operators in the field, a shooter whose abilities bordered on the supernatural. Other operatives requested her specifically when they needed Overwatch support. Agencies that had initially overlooked her now competed for her services. And through it all, Sarah remained grounded. She never forgot where she came from. She kept the challenge coin Marcus had given her in her pocket on every mission. She stayed in touch with him and the other SEALs who had first believed in her, visiting Blackwood whenever her schedule allowed. She sent Christmas cards to Colonel Harrison and flowers to Elena Vega on her birthday. She remembered every person who had helped her along the way, and she tried to pay that debt forward whenever she could. Because for all her success, Sarah understood something that many exceptional people never learned. She had not gotten here alone. She had been given opportunities by people who saw potential in her when she could not see it in herself. Without Marcus Cole handing her that rifle, without the SEALs taking the time to train her, without Director Chen pushing her to develop her full potential, she would still be setting up targets on a range in Virginia. 5 years after that first morning at Blackwood, Sarah found herself back where it all began. She had been invited to speak at a training seminar for a new class of operators. The facility had changed, expanded, modernized. But the ranges were still there, and when Sarah walked along the firing lines, she could almost see her younger self carefully positioning targets in the early morning light. Marcus was there. His hair had more gray in it now, and there were new lines around his eyes. But his smile was the same. That warm expression of someone who saw the best in people and took joy in watching them succeed. They stood together at the edge of the main range, watching a group of trainees go through their paces. The shooters were good, disciplined, and dedicated. But Sarah could tell, just by watching, which ones had the gift and which ones were simply skilled. It was the same instinct Marcus had shown all those years ago. He asked her if it was strange being back. She said it felt like coming home, because in a way it was. This was the place where Sarah Mitchell had discovered who she really was. This was the place where a maintenance worker had become something extraordinary. Then Marcus pointed to someone in the group of trainees, a young woman, barely 20, with the same uncertain posture Sarah had once carried. She was struggling with the rifle, her shots going wide, her frustration evident. The other trainees were ignoring her, focused on their own performance. She was invisible. Marcus asked Sarah what she saw. Sarah watched the young woman for a long moment. She noticed the way she held the rifle, the natural alignment of her body, the instinctive corrections she was making even as she failed to connect with her targets. The girl had no formal training, no support, no one believing in her. But she had something else. She had the gift. Sarah smiled. She walked onto the range, approaching the young woman with an easy confidence that would have been unthinkable to her younger self. The trainee looked up, startled, unsure who this stranger was or what she wanted. Sarah did not introduce herself. She did not explain her credentials or her history. She simply took the rifle from the young woman's hands, made a small adjustment to the scope, and handed it back. Then she told the trainee to breathe, to relax, to trust her instincts instead of fighting them. The young woman raised the rifle. She followed Sarah's instructions, letting go of the tension in her shoulders, allowing her body to find its natural alignment. And then she pulled the trigger. The bullet struck center mass, a perfect hit. The trainee lowered the rifle and looked at Sarah with wonder. She asked how she had known what was wrong. She asked who Sarah was and how she could have fixed the problem so easily. Sarah thought about the question. She thought about all the answers she could give, all the explanations of technique and physics and biomechanics. But none of those things captured the truth of what had just happened. So instead, she told the young woman a story. She told her about a maintenance worker who had spent her days setting up targets and her nights wondering if she would ever matter. She told her about a Navy SEAL who had seen something nobody else could see. She told her about fear and doubt and the long journey from invisibility to purpose. And then Sarah gave the young woman the same gift that Marcus had once given her. She said she believed in her. She said she saw potential. She said that if the trainee was willing to work and to trust in herself, she could become something extraordinary. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She asked if Sarah really meant it. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the challenge coin she had carried for 5 years. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the weight of its meaning, and then she pressed it into the trainee's palm. She told the young woman to keep it. She said it had been given to her by someone who believed in her when no one else did. Now it was being passed on, a reminder that everyone has the potential for greatness, if only someone is willing to see it. Marcus watched from the edge of the range, his eyes bright with emotion. He had started something 5 years ago, a ripple that was now spreading outward in ways he could never have predicted. Sarah Mitchell had gone from setting up targets to saving lives, and now she was doing for someone else what he had done for her. Sarah walked back to stand beside him. They watched together as the young trainee took shot after shot, each one more confident than the last. The transformation was already beginning. Marcus put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Sarah smiled and looked out at the range where it had all started. The sun was setting over the Virginia hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. It was beautiful, this place. It was home. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The pain and the struggle, the loneliness and the fear. The morning when a stranger handed her a rifle and told her she was capable of something extraordinary. And she understood finally why she had endured all of it. She had endured so that she could stand here now, so that she could pass on what had been given to her, so that she could help the next invisible person discover that they were not invisible at all. That was her gift. Not just the ability to shoot with impossible precision, though she had that too. Her real gift was the ability to see potential in others, the same way Marcus had seen it in her, and that gift was something she would carry forward for the rest of her life. Sarah Mitchell had started out setting up targets on a range. She had become one of the most skilled operatives in the intelligence community. But her greatest achievement was not any single shot she had made or any life she had saved. Her greatest achievement was standing here, watching a young woman discover her own potential, knowing that the cycle was continuing. Some people are born extraordinary. Others become extraordinary through effort and opportunity. But the rarest and most precious thing is when extraordinary people use their gifts to lift others up, to see potential where others see nothing, to hand a rifle to a maintenance worker and say, "I believe in you." That was what Marcus Cole had done for Sarah Mitchell, and now she was doing it for someone else. The story was not ending. It was just beginning again.